he wore the same shirt as the shooter did, and he was walking down. He had some type of like body cam device.
We begin with a question that now haunts the search for justice in America. What happens to a nation's pursuit of truth when the trail goes cold because someone lied at the moment that mattered most? That hypothetical question is now a chilling reality in the wake of the Utah Valley University tragedy. It was here, in a moment of public gathering, that a single rifle shot turned a routine appearance by the public figure Charlie Kirk into a national tragedy. A wave of shock and grief was soon followed by a tentative, fragile relief when law enforcement moved swiftly. The man quickly arrested for the shot, Tyler James Robinson, became the immediate face of the tragedy. The public narrative solidified. A solitary, angry young man, driven by personal grievance, had committed the inexcusable act. Law enforcement, operating under immense pressure, had secured the scene, followed the initial leads, and seemingly contained the threat. The evidence that accumulated quickly appeared overwhelming. A rifle recovered on a rooftop opposite the auditorium. DNA swabs matching the weapon to items found at the scene, and most revealingly, a handwritten note clearly articulating the shooter's intent. Added to this were volumes of online messages that, when taken together, painted a clear psychological picture of a young man consumed by rage. This initial narrative, supported by strong physical and digital evidence, allowed the community to begin the painful process of mourning. But then, a shockwave, a second arrest that fundamentally changed the nature of the entire case. This arrest was seismic, not because it named a new perpetrator for the killing, but because it suggested a dark, calculated act of interference. It raised the possibility that someone had deliberately, strategically sabotaged the manhunt at a time when every second was precious. The news of this second individual, a 71-year-old man, arrived like a jolt through an already raw and grieving community. Investigators accuse him of stepping forward in the crucial, chaotic hours immediately following the assassination and falsely claiming to be the shooter. Prosecutors are not suggesting a delusion or a simple attention-seeking stunt. They argue this was a strategic move of deliberate obstruction. His false confession, they assert, forced officers to divert immense resources, personnel, surveillance teams, forensic experts, away from the real search. It sent them down a trail that led nowhere, wasting an irreplaceable window of time in the frantic, initial race to find the person who actually fired the fatal round. On its surface, this is unbelievable. Who admits to a murder they didn't commit? But the reality, as prosecutors frame it, is far darker and more strategic. This was a move designed to mislead, confuse, and buy time for someone else. If this is true, it doesn't just add a minor wrinkle to the investigation. It fundamentally rewrites the entire narrative of the early hours and forces a complete re-examination of how the case unfolded and whether the initial arrest was achieved efficiently or by mere narrative convenience. To fully appreciate the severity of this allegation, one must understand the inherent fragility of a manhunt. Every single minute spent chasing a false lead is a minute a real suspect uses to vanish. The allegation that a man intentionally fed investigators a false claim within hours of the killing is therefore far more than a trivial legal complication. It goes directly to the heart of whether the system was compromised in its capacity to protect the public. We are now left with a deeply bifurcated story that the public and the courts must somehow reconcile. The physical evidence pointing firmly to Tyler James Robinson, and the arrest of another individual accused of deliberately complicating the hunt for the killer, an action that prosecutors argue could have placed thousands of people at even greater risk. The existence of a strong body of evidence against the accused shooter, Robinson, must now be weighed against the sharp, disturbing accusations of calculated interference. This duality leads to two immediate and obvious questions for the public. First, why would anyone want to interfere with justice in such a precise and dangerous way? And second, did that interference actually work? Did the alleged obstruction materially alter the timeline of the investigation? Prosecutors assert unequivocally that it did. They claim the false claim diverted police attention, necessitated hours of painstaking verification to rule out the false confessor, and critically, spread their already thin resources during the most vital, vulnerable early window of the manhunt. These are not light accusations. They imply a sophisticated, malicious intent to obstruct and a clear understanding of the high stakes involved. The legal system treats such acts with extreme severity, not just because they are a gross waste of time, but because deliberate deception becomes a weapon when seconds mean the difference between capture and escape. But let's address the enigma of motive. Why would a 71-year-old man insert himself so forcefully into the white-hot center of a national manhunt? We must resist the immediate urge to leap to assumptions about psychology without verifiable evidence. Allegations of false confession can stem from various sources: a craving for attention, a pathological desire to be central to historic events, or even severe mental illness. Any of these scenarios, while tragic, would still constitute an egregious and criminal misuse of emergency resources. However, the most chilling possibility, and the one that elevates this from a mere oddity to a potential conspiracy, is the possibility of coordination with someone who stood to benefit. If the man who allegedly diverted investigators was acting as part of a premeditated plan, a calculated move intended to shield the true perpetrator, or an accomplice, then the case dramatically shifts from a solitary criminal act to a coordinated effort that potentially implicates a wider network. For the investigators, the task is now agonizingly complex. They need to map every minute. They need to know the precise moment the false confession was made, which units were diverted in response, how long those resources were tied up, and whether any legitimate leads were delayed or went cold because of the diversion. This requires tracking call logs, analyzing radio traffic, cross-referencing patrol movements, and meticulously matching surveillance timestamps. The purpose is to create an unsentimental reconstruction of where the manhunt was slowed. If the diversion was impactful, the record of time lost will be clear, feeding both the criminal obstruction charges and potentially future civil scrutiny regarding the operational management of the emergency response. At the same time, prosecutors must reinforce the strength of their case against Tyler Robinson. The sheer quantity of evidence, the ballistic analysis, the spent casings, the DNA traces, anchored the initial arrest. If someone intentionally diverted attention, the defense team for Robinson will certainly argue that the path to that evidence was somehow corrupted, or that the rush caused by the diversion led to an arrest of convenience. The key for the prosecution in the obstruction case is to prove intent, that the person not only lied, but understood the gravity of the consequences, and acted with the goal of undermining the system. This requires a high legal bar. The law, in pursuing this obstruction charge, recognizes the paramount public interest in an unimpeded inquiry. When someone attacks that process by lying or fabricating a confession, they are attacking the very system that protects communities. To overcome the doubts introduced by the obstruction, investigators must now achieve a level of meticulous reconstruction rarely seen in criminal cases. This means moving beyond standard evidence collection to creating a granular map of those critical hours. They will be issuing subpoenas for all call records, radio logs, and surveillance feeds, extending even to vendor records if any venue staff or production team members are implicated in the diversion. The objective is to be able to state, without a shadow of a doubt, not only that the diversion occurred, but whether it meaningfully impaired the hunt for Robinson, or if the arrest would have been made regardless. We must remain clear-eyed about the possible scenarios this digital and physical reconstruction will reveal. On one hand, the false confession may have been reckless, but ultimately ineffectual, a distraction that law enforcement overcame. On the other hand, the diversion may have provided a critical window for other actors, an accomplice hiding evidence, an associate fleeing the area, or a network coordinating their exit strategies. Forensic work that identifies gaps in surveillance timelines coinciding with periods of reduced police pressure will strongly point toward this more troubling possibility of a coordinated criminal effort. Simultaneously, we must consider the critical role of digital footprints in untangling this web of deception. The same technologies, phone pings, social media posts, and digital surveillance that help investigators track suspects also create new avenues for obstruction. A person who falsely confesses often leaves a digital trail that can reveal whether they acted alone or in concert. Investigators will be poring over metadata, texts, emails, and social media posts to establish if the man who falsely confessed had any pre-existing contact with the accused shooter, Tyler Robinson. Establishing pre-existing contact would drastically shift the case from opportunistic attention-seeking to premeditated criminal conspiracy. The public conversation must be careful not to conflate mere distraction with outright complicity. Not every false lead implies a conspiracy. Some false confessions stem from mental illness or impulse. This is why the law makes a sharp distinction between motive and capacity. A deliberate attempt to mislead, especially one that shows knowledge of the stakes and an interest in covering for someone else, is entirely different from a confused or attention-seeking claim. Prosecutors must prove criminal intent, that the accused knew precisely what he was doing and understood the life and death consequences of his actions. That evidentiary bar is exceedingly high, and it will require the most robust documentary record to meet. Furthermore, the defense team for Robinson will exploit every aspect of the obstruction charge. They will relentlessly press for full discovery, demanding to know precisely how the false claim influenced the investigative choices made by law enforcement. They will argue that the chaos and resource diversion may have led to a hurried, potentially corrupted path to the evidence that led to Robinson's arrest. Prosecutors, in turn, must be prepared to show that their case rests on a broad, unshakable body of evidence that cannot be undone by distraction. The court will become the testing ground for all these interwoven threads, the admissibility of evidence, the credibility of the entire manhunt operation, and ultimately, the fairness of the trial for both the alleged shooter and the accused obstructor. Beyond the courtroom, the second arrest reveals a profound human toll and ignites vital conversations about societal resilience. For Charlie Kirk's family and supporters, every new twist in the narrative is a cruel reactivation of grief. The possibility that the truth may still be obscured or that justice was actively fought against is profoundly destabilizing. For the community that gathered at Utah Valley University, the possibility that a figure tried to maliciously mislead investigators is terrifying. It raises critical, uncomfortable questions about whether other public gatherings are vulnerable to not only violence, but also to coordinated efforts to create confusion and impede the response. It's one thing for a crime to be committed. It is an entirely separate betrayal for the public response to be purposefully hampered from within. The community's fundamental trust in the institutions designed to protect it is severely tested when an investigation is disrupted in this manner. This case has already sparked political and social debates about how to secure large public events without sacrificing the atmosphere of open discourse. Event planners, security consultants, and public officials are now forced to look hard at the vulnerabilities exposed by both the shooting and the alleged interference. How do you balance a warm, accessible venue with the absolute need for layered, effective security that cannot be sidetracked by false claims? There is no perfect answer, but the ensuing discussion will be vital to national security planning. It is not enough merely to prosecute those who obstruct. Society must learn to make itself resilient against the tactics of those who seek to exploit public fear and chaos. As the legal process unfolds, there are critical civic responsibilities that must be upheld. News media must balance the imperative to inform with the profound risk of amplifying unverified claims or rumors that could both hamper the